LTV, Channel 12.
Good evening and welcome to Talking Point. Tonight our topic is patriotism. Patriots are forged in times of crisis. It becomes a challenge then to define patriotism in peacetime. We know that it involves more than making regular trips to vote and saluting the flag when it passes by, but how do we show our love of country when the parade has passed? Paul Lewis joined the Marine Corps because, he says, in his community, service to the country was expected. Lewis was among those Americans held hostage in Tehran in the early days of the Iranian Revolution. He says his feelings for his country kept him going through his long captivity.
I think that what my generation views as patriotism probably arose from the experiences of the World War II generation. Our nation was attacked. People stacked up lines, and we remember the sacrifice and commitment. We don't hear much about draft dodgers, that sort of thing. I'm sure it went on in the Second World War. But so I think our perception is where the nation was truly threatened in a physical sense, they were all banded together and went. In today's environment, I don't think we have that same sort of feeling. My own generation, I very seldom run into veterans of my age. It's few and far between.
Yeah, I think that there are two components to patriotism. There's what you feel, and there's what you do. There's a more active component to patriotism. I think it's the what you do that most people think of as patriotism, which may be the flag waving, at West Point, the marching, the uniforms, the trappings of patriotism. I think as I've gotten older, the trappings have become less of the true definition of patriotism as opposed to, what you feel, what you think, how you see your responsibilities as a citizen.
Patriotic fervor was running high at the close of the Gulf War, but quickly faded as life returned to normal. And that leaves us with a question. How do we express patriotism in times that are normal?
For the last couple of years after Desert Storm and euphoria of coming back from Desert Storm, I've seen the country go a little bit down from being as patriotic as before. It seems like more people are waving the flag and trying to be patriotic for their own benefits. Is it to sell a car or sell a product? In today's society, I think people should show their patriotism in different ways. Community service, volunteer work, volunteer at schools in their community, which will make this whole country a lot better.
If I love my country, then I want my country to be a good citizen of the world. So patriotism doesn't only involve what we do that's good for Americans right here, right now. It involves what we do that's good for our neighbors. Otherwise, in the long run, it's not going to be good for Americans either. So,
Americans have long believed in protest, but we also believe in conformity. How do we keep the two in balance as we think about our relationship to government and our role as citizens?
Patriotism, I think, becomes dangerous when it's interpreted as a non-critical acceptance of claimed authority, that is to say, power. That's particularly true in a democracy. It seems to me in a democracy, one has to be critically patriotic. That is to say, one has to recognize that there are certain obligations to obey, but also certain obligations to criticize and sometimes certain obligations not to obey. If we give up that as citizens in a democracy, then it seems to me we give up democracy. We don't have it.
I don't think that patriotism, the definition of patriotism is love your country, right or wrong. I think that's a simplistic view of patriotism that sometimes, used as a definition. I don't love my country, right or wrong. There's, a lot about this country that grieves me, a lot about its history, a lot about what it's doing in the present that grieves me, and it's my patriotism that, makes me committed to changing those things. And that may be particularly, I may be particularly sensitive to that as an African American. This country hasn't been, the easiest place, for us to live historically. It's not the easiest place for us to live today. I'm committed to, changing that, though. I think that's what being a good patriot is, trying to make your country live up to its ideals.
Joining us tonight, we have three guests. Joe Miller is an undergraduate academic advisor in political science at the University of Illinois. He served in the U.S. Navy during the Vietnam War. During his time in the Navy, he began to question U.S. policy in the region, and after leaving the Navy, became an active participant in the anti-war movement. More recently, he worked to organize veterans in opposition to the Persian Gulf War. Joe Berg is the Director of Public Relations for the Illinois Veterans of Foreign Wars. He's also served as post commander and a district commander in the VFW. And also with us is Walter Feinberg, Director of the Program for Cultural Values and Ethics at the University of Illinois. He's also a Professor of Educational Policy Studies. A bit later in the show, we'll be opening up phone lines, and we'll be taking your questions and comments as well. So as you listen to our conversation, be thinking about those questions you would like to ask our guests. Thank you all very much for being here. We appreciate it. I came across a quote from George Bernard Shaw that I liked a lot, that I thought I would just give at the beginning. He was always a man with the ready quip. Shaw said, "Patriotism is your conviction that this country is superior to all other countries because you were born in it." And we can laugh at that, and yet sometimes patriotism does go that far and no farther. And what I think is interesting about what the people that we talked to said was that very quickly they went beyond this abstract idea of patriotism and started talking about really what amounts to citizenship. They started talking about what are the obligations of the patriot. If we say that we love our country, then what? Where do we go from there? And maybe that's a place that we can start. Let me ask Joe Berg, we can start with you. What do you think are the obligations of citizens? What is it that we do to demonstrate our patriotism?
Well, I think you touched on that or opened the door for me a little bit in your opening comments about the fact what happens after the flag goes by. As you know, I am the Director of Public Relations for a large organization in the state of Illinois, and you may wonder just what is it that the Veterans of Foreign Wars does and what it's all about. The purpose of a public relations department or department leadership is to get the public to understand that we do more than sit in a bar all day and tell war stories. That is not the purpose of the Veterans of Foreign Wars. The purpose of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, as it was formed back in 1899, was to help the veteran and also the survivors, the family, and so forth. And one of the bigger things was to promote patriotism. Now, promoting patriotism is more than flag waving. Our policy and our programs dictate that. You open the door, I could stay here all night telling you about the program, but I don't want to do that.
What do you do to promote patriotism? What are you hoping people will do?
We try to make the public aware of the fact of what we do, like I said, other than sitting drinking beer all day. Number one, we have community service programs. We have a Voice of Democracy program for youth. We have a blood donor program. We've got about 18 programs that we work out throughout the year. We have child abuse and missing children's programs. We have programs for sponsoring patriotism among the lower grades in school, kindergarten, first, second, third, and fourth, and fifth grade for poster contests. We make awards for this. For those in the 7th and 8th grade, we have speech writing contests. For those in 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, we sponsor what they call the Voice of Democracy program, where they can earn scholarship money for college.
Well, okay, let me stop you just and ask a question. I'm curious. With the littlest kids, what are you trying to get from them? I mean, as they express patriotism, or as you try to communicate to them, and what is it that a child of that age can articulate?
We try to explain to them the flag, the country, the benefits that they have, and then they have the opportunity then to put on picture or writing how they feel back about their flag or what their, and get into the higher grades as to what their place in America's future is. In other words, it's a two-way street, and basically we just try to communicate to them what patriotism is, let them tell us back how they feel.
Let me ask Joe Miller, what are the obligations of patriotism? If one says that you were a patriot, then what?
Well, I've gone through some changes on this because I came out of part of the generation that the sons and daughters of World War II veterans. My father was an infantryman in the Battle of the Bulge, and there were photographs of me standing outside of a pup tent in our backyard trying to salute the flag and missing my forehead, usually, at the age of 2. And I enlisted in the service in 1961, right out of high school, partially out of a feeling of, seeing that as service to the country. And that was the way many of us were raised to think of patriotism, service to the country. And it was, in my view, rather narrowly defined in what I would call now militaristic terms. Service to the country is putting on a uniform, saluting the flag, promoting that kind of allegiance. And many of us coming out of the Vietnam experience, not all by any means, but many of us came out of that experience having serious questions about what patriotism actually was. And the organization that I worked with, Vietnam Veterans Against the War, which was established in 1967 in the midst of that war, basically redefined patriotism for ourselves to mean that what you need to do is critically serve your country. Mm-hmm. It wasn't a question of not loving the country, it was a question of redefining what it meant to serve your country. And at that particular point in time, and since that time, many of us have continued to feel that patriotism is service in a critical fashion, that when your country is wrong, you make sure that you set it right, and you do whatever you need to do to set it right. It's part of what I appreciated of some of the comments of the people that introduced the program, particularly the military people. There was, for me, a very surprising recognition on the part of this current generation of service people that patriotism means more than the flag waving and so on. It means community service, it means challenge to your country's leaders when you see that they're wrong, and trying to turn the country around.
Let's go to our third guest, Walter Feinberg. What do you think about the concept of patriotism and the way that we articulate it now? I mean, is it something that's still an important cultural value? And in what ways, perhaps, has it changed between, the time the one Joe was in the service and then the time that the other one was here?
Well, I certainly do think that it's an important cultural value and will continue to be so. I think at its core is an expression of belongedness to a moral community that extends beyond the family and beyond the locale into a larger network of people that are tied together in some political fashion. And that will continue. I think that the shifts and changes in patriotism may have to do with the particular generational experiences, to some degree, that Joe and Joe had. One of the roll-in guests mentioned that in World War II the country was attacked, and it was. Hawaii, Pearl Harbor was bombed. And in Vietnam, the country was not attacked. It was, in fact, the aggressor. And so that explains, to some degree, the differences, I think, between the two. It also, I think, may explain why the education for patriotism that Joe on my left expresses is one of devotion and the one
Joe Miller is more of a critical education.
Well, let me ask Joe Berg, and I'm interested in how you react to Joe Miller and his assertion that patriotism can mean and perhaps should mean challenging authority. What is the role of protest in patriotism?
Well, I think that the role of protest, if properly handled and not unruly or causing violence or harm or damage to property and so forth, is one that we have a right of in this country. I don't think there's any doubt about that. As far as veterans against the war in the Gulf, that, of course, we know these organizations come up from time to time. And I think they have the same right that we as the veterans of foreign wars have to express our opinions. We express our opinions through letter writing. We don't do much demonstrating, but we express our opinions to our elected officials by letter campaigns, telephone campaigns, and so forth. And we do this quite frequently if we disagree with what our leaders are doing or what programs they're trying to come out with. And we feel it is an effective way of doing it. We feel it's a proper way, just as Joe feels his way is a proper way of doing it.
So you wouldn't, I mean, I don't know, for example, what your feelings were about the Gulf War, but you wouldn't say that Joe Miller was any less patriotic because he thought that the United States shouldn't be there.
No, I wouldn't feel that way. I mean, he served his country like other veterans in times of combat when his country asked him to serve. And certainly he has a right to express his opinion. I mean, that's what's so great about our country.
What if he was not a veteran? I mean, would you feel differently about it?
Probably not.
Probably not.
One of the problems, let me just jump in.
Sure.
One of the problems that many of us coming out of the Vietnam period experienced with veterans of my father's generation was and this is something that we continue to carry around with us, is this and it's partially the reason that we engage in protest against authority, is that authority was clearly, for many of us, illegitimate. And you will find a lot of anti-war veterans, and probably veterans who don't really have a position clarified one way or the other, coming out of that period, having a lot of serious distrust of government officials and people who have any kind of authority, and it's colored our generation, I think, in the way we do things, in the way we do protest, and the way we react to what many of us refer to as the traditional veterans groups and traditional veterans organizations. And there were a lot of Vietnam vets who will tell you about pretty rough times they had with traditional veterans organizations when they came back from Vietnam, and a lot of the negative stuff that came out. And I'm not laying this on Joe because it's a lot of it is individualized.
Well, I think he wanted to make some comment.
Yes, I agree with you that initially veterans organizations, whether because of the age of the other ones or the experience or the different type of circumstances, we know full well that the veteran from Vietnam came back and was spat upon and ridiculed because he had served his country, and people who didn't believe in that particular engagement would ridicule the veteran instead of the people that should have been ridiculed, or for those that perhaps made some errors in judgment along the way. And yes, when the veterans of Vietnam joined the organizations, and I can say this, that there were a few times that perhaps they got the wrong impression, and I think that it's hard sometimes for the old-timers to give up some of that control and so forth, and when new ideas come along. But I'm very pleased to say that we have a large contingent of Vietnam veterans in our organization. We have a lot of Vietnam veterans that are leaders in many categories, and we have our POW, MIA groups that are working within the content of the government and so forth to get this problem resolved, not only in Vietnam. They start out with Vietnam, and you must admit that of any group of veterans or any group of people, this group got the attention of the people of the United States and of Congress and of all of our leadership. Then now they are also expanding that to want to talk about the MIAs and POWs from Korea, even back to World War II. And we know, of course, the ages of those gentlemen and ladies would be perhaps to the point where most of them had passed on from World War II or World War I. But this group of people we feel have blended into our organization very well. On a national basis, we've had the Vietnam vets as our national commander-in-chief. And so, you know, we're proud of the fact that we think we can get together and do a very good job together.
One issue that I want to raise and see what you think about is nationalism, because we have seen a lot of places around the world where nationalism has led to great bloodshed and destruction. And you know, one might say that nationalism is hyper-patriotism. It's patriotism taken too far. It's patriotism that says, my country, no matter what, and we'll stomp on anybody who happens to get in the way. It's xenophobic and chauvinistic. How do we keep patriotism, in a sense, reined in, so that it doesn't get to that point?
Are
you? Yeah, do you have it? Give me a thought.
Thanks. I think that you nationalism, I think, is a two-edged sword. Again, I think that one side of nationalism, one side of nationalism is like patriotism, the expression of membership in a community, a moral community, and it's an emphasis on particularity. Now, in itself, there's nothing wrong with particularity, and in some instances, it's a very good value to have. I mean, if, for example, to take an opposite value, if you find me feeding the neighborhood but starving my family, you would say that I don't have enough particularity, that I'm too universal in my generosity. But there's as you say, there's a line beyond which serving my kind, and perhaps it be my race instead of my nation, can become destructive both of other people and indeed of ourselves as well, as we become uncritical servants of an ideal that we haven't really examined closely.
It's something that I think you say that you've thought about quite a lot. Is there a danger that patriotism becomes destructive, and how does one prevent it from going to that point?
Yeah, I think there is a danger. If you take feelings of nationalism and you attach to those feelings of nationalism the military and economic power of a country like the United States, which is beginning to feel under certain threats, economically. I think it becomes very easy then to take the nationalism and the power, mix it together into a form of patriotism, which then allows people to go off to war to defend the country, even though it's 10, 15,000 miles away. And so I see a real danger to patriotism that is limited to one's own kind, so to speak. And the captain from West Point, who spoke in the roll-in, raised the questions that I think are part of what we need to do to kind of control that patriotism. We need to have a critical understanding of our own history. We need to know what our limitations are as a nation-state in a global economy, in a global context. And we need to act as world citizens. So that I believe that patriotism needs to be extended beyond your own national borders to a kind of a global understanding of kind of a human membership. And another thing that's connected with the nationalism question, and Joe reminded me to kind of make a comment of this, the issue of MIAs, POWs, MIAs. The missing in action from the conflicts that we've been involved in tends to focus on those people who are Americans who are missing in action. It has been known for some time that the United States has files and records on the nearly 200,000 to 300,000 Vietnamese missing in action that might assist the Vietnamese in coming to some resolution of their own missing in action cases. And we have tended to focus on our own with some certainly understandable concern, but I think a global citizen kind of response, a patriotic response, would be to also assist the Vietnamese in trying to resolve some of their cases.
Let me, Joe Berg, I think, wants to make a response. I'll get to you just in a second. One thing, though, I want to do first is just remind people who are watching that in a moment or two, we'll start taking calls from viewers. So if you have a question or you have some comments that you'd like to bring to us, the number to call is 333-3495. And if you're outside of the 217 code area, you can make it a collect call. We'd be happy to pick up the charges. So the number will appear there on the screen if you would like to call in. And in fact, if you're ready to call right now, go ahead and go to the phone and dial up the number. I cut in on you, and I think you wanted to pick up on something that Joe Miller was saying.
The question I have on the comments there about the Vietnamese missing in action, this type of thing, POWs, I wonder if some of the other nations of the world really care about their missing in action or POWs like we care. I think you hit the nail on the head and said we have a right and responsibility for our own people. But also, I'm wondering, do these other nations really care what happened to them?
I mean, do you think that somehow the Vietnamese don't care for their own missing from that war?
Their government, I don't know. I'm just asking the question. I've heard that expressed, and I'm not an expert, but I've heard that expressed that other nations really don't care about the people that don't come home.
I would have trouble understanding why that would be the case unless you think that they're rather different sorts of beings than we are, that somehow they don't have ties to their fellow citizens. I've heard that expressed too, but I've never really taken it very seriously. I do recall, just to pick up a comment of Joe's, in the Metropolitan, I think it was either the Metropolitan or Museum of Modern Art in New York, there was a display of just panel after panel of 8 feet by how many feet, I don't know, of the names of Vietnamese who were killed in the Vietnam conflict. And on that panel there must have been a few 100,000 names. And that expression of grief, I think, is terribly important to be felt, because those are human beings as well as, of course, the many soldiers, Americans, who died in that war.
And I suppose that one of the sad features of war, but perhaps it's one of the necessary features of war, is that for you to be able to go out and kill other people, you've got to be convinced that they're not quite on your level. I mean, if you think that they're
That's
just
right.
like me, then how do you pull the trigger? And that often it's what governments have to do to convince their people to go to war is to persuade them that these people, they're really not like us. They're not even really human. They're less than human, and that makes it a little easier for one to do it. And it's that dehumanizing of the enemy that probably happens in all wars, and perhaps has to happen, or else people wouldn't go.
But at the same time, with the dehumanization that takes place, you've got stories from almost every conflict that you can think of where there have been occasions, and this is true of some parts of World War II, there have been occasions when troops from other sides have come together and met each other as human beings, and the war stops for a while. And the reality is, and this gets to the whole question of authority, the reality is that the authority sends people, all governments do this, send people to their deaths for government policies, and that the individuals involved in these conflicts, the people who wear the uniform, don't really have any vested interest in those policies. You're given a weapon, you go and you fight. And there is a certain dehumanization that's necessary in order to get people to do that, because it's not a natural condition of human beings to do that. And so that's one of the reasons why I think it's important to raise the questions of what happens to the people on the other side, what happened to them. When I would give talks about the Gulf War before the war actually started, I would always talk about brothers in arms, the Iraqi soldiers who were wearing the uniform who were just as much victims of this war as the American troops that I didn't want to see go either. And I think that's part of that explanation of, you know, enlarging the patriotism beyond your own national borders.
Can you buy that? The idea that the enemy is really your brother? That you're sort of all in the same boat?
Well, yes, from the standpoint that they are being patriotic to their country, as we are being patriotic to our country. They're doing what they believe to be their duty, and they're fighting in defense of their homeland as we are of ours, or for our ideals or purposes or whatever. There's no doubt that these are human beings across the line. There's no doubt that there's human beings running the show from behind the lines, any more than are in the United States of America. And I think that a case in point there would be in World War II with the fanatical deal of the Japanese. We've seen these movies and heard the stories about how fanatical they were about the rising sun flag. And I think that they were, if you talk about patriotism, being oriented and trained to do something, to kill, to whatever, or to have themselves die for their country, that is being a fanatical type of patriotism. As Joe mentioned before, we've taken patriotism now into a different area, a much broader area. And when the Independence Day is over with, I hope that people remember that while they perhaps saluted the flag at the parade or went out to the parade, that they respected the flag in proper manner, but that from the next 364 days that they remember their country and are patriotic in other areas. It's kind of like Mother's Day and Father's Day. You know, it's nice to salute your mother and father on their day, but it doesn't do much good if you don't respect them the rest of the year. They must not have that either.
Well, I'll tell you what, why don't we start talking with people who are watching, and let's go first to our line number 1. Tell us where you're calling from tonight.
Calling from Solano, Mr. Inge, and I guess I just want to make a few, I want to just make a few comments.
Sure.
For yourself, Mr. Miller, I can really tell that neither one of you fully understand the military, especially yourself. You say people won't go. When I was in the military, I had to go. And the problem with Vietnam, and Mr. Miller knows it as well as I do, you can't go out and clear an area 5 times and get much feeling out of it. And you see your buddies' boots coming back with their feet in them and their bodies in another bag. It just wears you down. It was our leaders and the policy. It had nothing to do with our soldiers. I thank Mr. Berg for his organization. When my dad was dying, he was a World War II vet. He died 3 years ago. 3 nights I had to hold him down while he fought World War II all over again. The VFW and Mr. Joe Simonich were the only ones that would help him. They're the ones that carried him out of this life, and they carried him through this life. And I really, really appreciate this organization, and they're helping me now. But I guess the main thing I'd like to know is, why does patriotism have to be considered military service? Why? You take the young woman, the black woman, who is a graduate of West Point. I admire that. That is tremendous. But she was not given orders to think. If she is going to be in the military, voluntarily, she does what the military says. I'll try not to hold this up, but can we please understand that patriotism involves more than killing?
I think that I think that's.
Finish this off, Mr. News. I want to tell you, when I came back, I became a pacifist. I became a moderate person, but I could still understand what duty, honor, and so forth is. Do you understand? I thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for the call. I think I would say to the caller and to anybody else, I mean, I think one of the points we're trying to make, and I think it came through with the people that we talked to at the beginning of the program, was that patriotism does go beyond military service. And in fact, in a time like this, in peacetime, we've got to find some other ways to define it. Hopefully, you know, we won't, you know, that perhaps it's being foolishly idealistic, I would say. Let's hope we don't have any more wars, you know. So we'd better find some other way to express it.
There is one thing, though, that the caller mentioned that I'd like to, if I understood him right, and I'm not sure that I did, but I would like to take exception to. It seemed to be the case that the caller was saying that there's an absolute and a fundamental difference between being in the military and being out of the military, whereas being in the military, you're told to take orders and you have to follow those orders. And outside of the military, then you have the luxury to think it over. Actually, I think that's legally not right. That is, a soldier in the military who's given an order that's illegal, I believe, is bound not to follow that order. Now, there are a lot of soldiers who left Vietnam because they thought the thing through and they decided they just couldn't agree with the policy. And I think that if they gave that war due consideration with the effects on the principles that they believed in mind, that they have to be thought of as real patriots, as well as the people who fought the war and did so reflectively and consciously and believing in the principles that they thought were there.
Okay. Let's, the two of you, maybe hold on to your thoughts, and I want to go on again, and we'll get you in on some other callers here. Let's go to line number 2. Hello.
Hi, I'm calling from Pekin,
Mm-hmm.
and the gentleman that just spoke, I'm not sure if I understood what he said correctly about the people who did not go to Vietnam should be considered patriots, the ones who were against the war. Did I understand that, sir?
I said the ones who did not go to Vietnam, who thought the issue through and reflected on it in terms of the principles that they felt should be honored the most.
Well, I think that is one of the key problems as far as your patriotism, because what you've done is you've taken people who refused to do their duty on the grounds that they felt that they didn't have to or shouldn't have to. They were allowed not to go and do what they were supposed to do, which was to defend their country, follow their laws of the country, and when they were all given amnesty, it in turn caused a real rift in the fabric of this country as far as what defines patriotism. The problem we have with that is that people who did go over to Vietnam, and I spent 18 months there. There were many things I didn't agree with. I did not follow any illegal orders. You're correct on that. If it's an illegal order, you do not have to follow it. But again, when you have a large group going, following their country's laws, and another group blatantly disobeying them, and then be given amnesty and far better treatment than the people that went, that is where you're shredding the fabric of patriotism by not supporting your military people.
Okay, I think we take your point, and I want to throw this one to Joe Miller, because I think that you would see it differently, and I want to make sure the caller knows, if he wasn't listening at the beginning of the program, that Joe is a Vietnam veteran. What about the idea that, would you say the people who stayed at home and protested the war were also patriots?
Definitely. It was one of the realities of veterans who came home in 1967, and particularly after 1968, after the Tet Offensive, and after that perspective of the possibility of winning the war began to be questioned more and more by wider numbers of people. When many of my brothers came home in Vietnam Veterans Against the War, they began to identify patriotism with protest and with dissent, sometimes almost exclusively to that, largely in a what might be seen as a reaction to their own sense of having been suckered into something, right? And I don't pretend to speak for all Vietnam vets, but I'm basically speaking for people who have worked with our organization. The people who protested and dissented against the war and tried to stop the war and tried to end it early enough so that myself and my brothers could come home in one piece, those people saw that as a duty, as a patriotic duty. And it helped a lot of us come to a new understanding of what patriotism was. Because the reality is, again, I'll just try to do this real quickly, our generation was raised to believe in patriotism in a fairly narrow way. Your country calls, you put on the uniform, you enlist, or you accept the draft notice and you go. You don't question. You don't try to find the reasons for it. One of the things that our generation had to learn was that there were other ways, more expanded notions of patriotism, and it involves a duty to protest, a duty to in the case of Professor Fields mentioned earlier, sometimes to disobey. Yeah. That expanded for a lot of us what patriotism was.
I want to make sure we get onto some other calls, but I want to ask Joe Berg to respond to that same question. How would those people who, let's leave aside the Vietnam veteran who came back and decided to oppose the war, those people who were opposing the war at home during Vietnam, were those people patriots?
I want to go around that just a little bit by what Mr. Miller said. I don't think that there's any war that's exempt from people protesting. I think that they're protesting World War I, World War II, Korean conflict, Vietnam conflict, the recent one in Kuwait. And my question is that while the Korean and the Vietnamese one was not a declared war, would there be a difference in your feeling if Congress declared war instead of a political leader going into the country?
Good question.
Because there you got a whole lot more power, and you're talking now about a lot more power coming down because World War I and World War II were declared wars. The other two were not.
Right, exactly. And one of the things that I've learned, much later, is to actually have a lot of respect for those people who took the heat in protesting against World War I and World War II out of very principled positions. I think that if the war had been declared in Vietnam, it would have been much more difficult. It might have also been much more acceptable.
With a desire to win.
Don't know. Okay, that gets into the whole question. That's a whole different show. That's a whole different show. I don't think the war could have been declared because of what it was set out to do. There was no way that war could be declared in the United States of 1963, 1964.
I don't want to get stuck on, we don't want to get into a conversation about the Vietnam War. Was it right or wrong? We could be here for a long time. And I do want to get into some other callers. Was there something real quick you wanted to?
No, just that there's a difference between a war that might be procedurally justified, as the Vietnam War probably was not, because it wasn't declared by Congress, and a war that is substantially justified, where the cause is a justified cause, which is, of course, up for debate, but I think that it's certainly no person who says that it was, as I would, that it was not a justified war is no less a patriot than someone who believes that the war itself, whether it was called, it was procedurally correct or not, was a justified war.
Okay, let's go on again. Go to caller line number 3. Hello, go ahead.
I went in the Marines in 1977 when I was 17 years old, and I was very conservative, very patriotic. That's the area I grew up in. And for quite a while in the Marines, I was the same way, and I was very successful in the Marines, was promoted quickly, and a lot of medals and all this sort of thing. But I was in the Marines during most of the Reagan and Bush years, a little bit of Carter, and I was involved in most of the counterinsurgency functions that were carried out in Central America, Middle East, and other areas. Especially, I spent 2 years in Beirut, and that experience changed my attitudes dramatically about this country, about the military, about the ideas of duty, honor, and serving your country that people have spoken of. I don't feel I was serving my country at all in Beirut. You're in a place where you're killing people, and your friends are being killed, and you look for reasons for this. You want to know why this is happening. And all these things that you're taught about this country, and it's a great democracy, and the flag, and saluting the flag, and all that stuff just doesn't come out as a solution, doesn't come out as a good enough reason for these things that you're doing and that you're seeing being done to your friends. When I look at the flag now, I don't feel anything for the flag. I feel nothing. I don't feel respect. I don't feel contempt. I don't feel anything. To me, being patriotic is calling on shows like this and saying what I think, telling other people what I think and how I feel about it.
Sure.
And I think different veterans deal with these things in different ways. You can hear a lot of us that are calling, it's hard for us to control our emotions because we're not just talking about abstract things. When I'm talking to you right now, I'm thinking about friends of mine who were blown to pieces, about people that I killed. And it's a very difficult thing to deal with.
Well, I appreciate your comments. I don't know if one or any of you would like to pick up on anything.
Let me mention one other thing.
Sure.
Talking about treatment of veterans, I respect Joe Berg and what he's doing. I think he's looking at things from a different viewpoint than I am in some respects. I think it needs to go both ways. If you're supposedly serving your country, which I don't feel I was doing at all, I was doing things in these other countries to these people in this country that I had been taught the United States was against, that we didn't support. And then when you see these things and you do these things and you participate in these things and then you come back here and things like we have the highest illiteracy rate of all industrialized nations, the most people in prison, the highest poverty level, those things, you really start to see those things because you've inflicted those on other people. And all that is against everything I was taught, so it's very difficult for me to believe in any of that. The government is supposed to serve us, too. And I'm a disabled vet, and I've been treated, I think, very badly by the VA, and so have most of the disabled vets that I know, combat veterans who lost arms and legs. And the VA did everything they could to get rid of them as quickly as possible, give them as little money as possible, give them as little support as possible. So I think it needs to go both ways. This thing in the Gulf War that's going on right now with all these unexplained illnesses where they don't want to give anybody any support and they're totally disabled is a perfect example.
I hate to sort of cut in on you, but
Okay.
Our time is moving.
All right, yeah.
I really appreciate your comments very much, and I want to see if
Sure.
some.
I can go on without realizing how long I'm talking. So.
Well, I think Joe Berg would like to respond to something you had to say.
Right, that he is a DAV, disabled veteran?
Yes.
And, okay, now see, this is one of the things that the Veterans of Foreign Wars is all about. To serve this veteran, now he said he's been shabbily treated, and I can understand that. I've heard all kinds of stories about that. We have a hospital program that tries to monitor this and prevent this type of thing. I feel badly that he had this bad experience, and I know he's not alone. Others have had it also. And I can appreciate his understanding or his feeling about patriotism, but we want to keep everything in moderation, as far as I'm concerned. And I think that through organizations such as ours, not just the VFW, the American Legion, DAV, and so forth, these people can be served, will be served. We have a problem, however, in getting enough money to do it all. Our volunteer part, just in Illinois alone last year, produced nearly $2 million worth of man-hours and donations and time traveled for the hospital program.
Yeah. We're coming to the point where we just have about 10 minutes, and I want to make sure that we get in some more callers, and unless you really, one of you would really like to respond to something that the caller said.
Just one quick comment about from what the last caller said, and I think one of the points that he was trying to make is that many of us see the way veterans are treated as an example or a reflection of the priorities of the society. And so you can send people off to war and have them do what their leaders tell them to do. They come back physically disabled or with deep psychological wounds that will probably never heal. My father's still dealing with stuff from World War II. And the government basically throws them away. And it's left to volunteer organizations, it's left to other vets who understand to try to pick up the pieces, almost literally. And that, I think the point comes through in his comment that this is a reflection of a society that's got its priorities wrong. It's not dealing with the costs. It hasn't recognized the costs.
Let's go on again to another caller. On line number 4. Hello.
Hi. I'm from Champaign, and I just wanted to call to say I agreed with the previous caller about service going both ways, and my question concerns the linkage between equal rights and patriotic military service. And I wanted to ask the panelists, do they believe that if a group who's been politically and socially excluded from society, such as, blacks during the Vietnam era and gays, lesbians, and bisexuals in today's era, do you still see that group as being obligated to serve their country, even though that country has not served them? And then secondly, what is the role of government in being patriotic to its citizens?
Okay. On first question, anybody want to?
It's a terrific question. It's the question of whether reciprocity in every instance is required of citizenship. I think, again, it depends a great deal on the justness of the cause that's being developed, but I think we try to, for groups that are excluded, gays, lesbians, blacks, I think it's very important that whatever they do, whether they choose or not choose to fight for their country, that the principle of inclusiveness be one that be at the heart of either their service or their protest. And that's all that I can say. I don't know whether, I don't think there's any hard and fast rule that if one is not included, you have no obligation. There are other things that you're included in that perhaps as other sides of identities that may one may be included in, that you might want to argue that there is an obligation because as a male I was included, but not as a Jewish male or whatever. But I do think the principle of inclusiveness is what needs to be at the heart of that debate.
Joe Berg, you want
to? Talking about patriotism relating to military service, I think it's important to remember that you don't have to be in the military to be patriotic. And there are many, many ways to serve your country from a patriotic manner other than putting on a uniform and go firing a rifle.
We're coming down to about 5 minutes, and I want to make sure people who are watching, if somebody wanted to dial up real quick, we could get him in. We had time for perhaps one more comment. One thing that I wanted to make sure that we touched on, got into, was this idea of patriotism in the sort of global society that we are heading towards, and whether, if indeed that happens, does that lead us to redefine our ideas of patriotism when we're talking about the need for people, for the world to be linked, more cooperative?
Definitely. The old notions of patriotism as being linked with, the concept of national sovereignty and the sanctity of one's own territory and one's own people is under serious, or needs to be under serious reconsideration now. Otherwise we fall into the same traps that we did before. And I don't have an answer as to how that is done. I think it involves a serious effort at kind of a global civic education, and part of it is certainly involved with our own educational system and the rather poor showing we have in terms of knowledge about the rest of the world. You can go to almost any other country around the globe, and they know more about us than we know about them. And I think that kind of points to an area that needs to be dealt with.
Let's. I think we have at least one more caller. We try to get in. And
say.
Okay. Yes. Okay.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It seems to me it's not even a question of ought. It's a question right now of what, because the strains on patriotism are going to be severe as people, for example, are no longer employed by American companies. So it's not that your business and your country are nicely congruent with one another. If you're employed by a Japanese company, you have a lot of concern about how well the Japanese are doing, as well as how well this country is doing. So it has to be developed a much more global sense of membership.
Let's go back and get this one last caller. It's on line number 1. Hello.
Hello.
Yes.
I think patriotism is really mixed up nowadays. There is no such thing as Latino Americans or German Americans or African Americans. You've got to be an American first. When you come to this country from another country and your immigration papers, you have to forego that country. And as one of our great forefathers said, our boundaries. We have to take care of what's in our boundaries. And we have mistreated lots of people in this country. The American Indian has been very badly treated, and he's really belongs here.
Yeah.
And the African American, there's no such thing as an African American.
Well, let's. I
Because
appreciate.
you have to be patriotic. You have to put aside the other nationalities.
We'll have to, I'm sorry, I have to cut in. You know, I apologize for doing that because we're really getting short on time. But the caller, I think, raises an interesting question. We're doing a lot of debating these days about something called multiculturalism and whether there's room for it in America. What about that idea of the hyphenated American and whether that person has to, can you be a hyphenated American and really truly be an American?
Well, the other side is how can you be an American without being a hyphenated American? We're all hyphenated.
And it's not unusual. This is a long, has a long history. You know, coming from a Polish American background, and you know, identifying ourselves as Polish Americans that's a long tradition.
Yeah. I think Joe Berg, you want to get on to
Last caller just said, I think it's basically true. You are an American. Once you take your citizenship, either you're a naturalized citizen of America or you come in and you become an American by going through certain processes, and you are an American. Now, when all is said and done, you still belong or you're still a citizen of that one country, whether it's Germany, USA, or what.
Does that, can people still hold on to their cultural identity?
Certainly.
And still be American?
Certainly. The only thing I don't know why they want to do. I happen to be of Norwegian background. I don't go around saying I'm a Norwegian American. I'm proud of my heritage, but if a group of Norwegians get together, you betcha we'll talk about it.
Can people hold, I mean, I think it's a fascinating question, one we don't really have enough time to talk about. But can you hold on to that identity and still be?
It's become a more important issue for those groups in this country who have been denied and disadvantaged true citizenship, and that's where it's an issue.
I'm sorry, I got to cut in on it, but we're at the end of the time, and we'll have to leave it there for tonight. We'd like to thank our guests, Joe Miller from the Department of Political Science at the University of Illinois, also Joe Berg, Director of Public Relations for the Illinois Veterans of Foreign Wars, and Walter Feinberg, Director of the Program for Cultural Values and Ethics at the University of Illinois. Talking Point will return on July 15th. That's 2 weeks from tonight, and our topic will be energy. What forms of energy will power the Midwest in the future? How can we use energy more efficiently? What concerns should we have about the U.S. and our dependency on foreign energy? And what would it take to make the USA energy self-reliant? Well, those are a few of the questions we'll consider on that next show, and we'll take your comments too. Between now and then, tune in for our radio talk show, Focus 580 on WILL Radio, weekday mornings at 10. For now, thanks for watching, and good night.
June Carter and Johnny Cash are featured in this year's celebration of a Capitol 4th, Sunday night at 7. Stay tuned now for Rumpole and the Right to Silence on Mystery. Visa, MasterCard, or Discover, call 1-800-528-7980. Please have the credit card number and expiration date ready. To order by mail, send a check for $24.95, payable to the U of I, WILL TV, to Videotape Sales, WILL TV, 1110 West Main Street, Urbana, Illinois, 61801. Please allow 3 to 4 weeks for delivery.